Okay, so here's something really interesting. I've been doing some more research into neuroscience, and I'm fascinated beyond words on it. And I've always kind of questioned about how people who are actually very rigid in their perspective of the world and of how religion and everything else has that kind of rigidity, if you would. I've always wondered why is it there are some people that are so rigid about it and there are some people that are so flexible about it. And one of the things that they're learning about is the prefrontal cortex and how, for instance, that's actually the area of the brain that is kind of like the editing processes of whatever. So it basically, if it tells you not to, speak terribly to a person or to speak curse words in front of other people that don't appreciate them, it's kind of like that editing, that decision making kind of thing. It also is where a lot of like our compassion or a lot of empathy derive from. And we already knew about the calcified pineal gland, how that actually separates you from source and having that connection to source as well. I've always kind of questioned about why it is that most people who are religious fundamentalists are about as atheistic as it gets. That's one of the parts of it. And the other part is the fact that people who are, in fact, religious fundamentalists, like I said, they have a very narrow, black and white, my way or the highway type of perspective. But I was always like, where does that come from? And it could come from a multitude of things. I mean, they did studies on people that have had strokes and how people who have had strokes are totally different from how they were before versus them being after. It could be if they were really uber religious before the stroke, that they would actually end up being almost like totally atheistic afterwards and vice versa. So there's that aspect alone. And that's one of the things that I've actually been looking at for a long time of why is it that most people who are part of organized religion seem to be very, shall we say, weak-minded? And that's not like me basically kind of like taking aim at it, but what I am saying is I'm noticing that pattern of behavior, that kind of blueprint of that system, if you would. And so in noticing that and then looking into neuroscience and what it actually has to say to substantiate it, and how not only are they going into things like strokes and health issues such as that, or even damage to a prefrontal cortex from either war situations or even like a motorcycle accident or playing really hard sports or whatever. They're also looking into like the aspects of like nutrition and diet and things like that, or how much air you're getting into your lungs and what have you, about the damages and the potential outcomes of anybody that is experiencing a damage, I guess you would say, to the prefrontal cortex. Like I said, it is like an editing syndrome. And how do we do that? And how do we deal with that? So more people now, more than ever, especially like on this app, on TikTok and everything else, and Instagram and Facebook and things like that, they're actually walking away in droves from organized religion because of the fundamentalist ideas, whether it's them being told that they're pieces of garbage for wearing a certain type of clothing or having a certain type of gender or a skin pigment or ethnicity or what have you. It becomes this whole thing of, is there anything that they're not going to get judged for? And what's interesting to me is we're talking about not just simply like one person, we're talking about like people that are functioning in droves like this, and it becomes very cliquey in a lot of ways, for lack of a better term. We've always seen kind of cliques in grade schools and in high schools and in workplaces of people who are like-minded and want to have an echo chamber. And let's face it, life is not about echo chambers, nor is it about black and white ideology. And one of the things I've always said whenever it comes to deriving information and looking at information is that you have to be completely flexible about it. You can't be married to the material. And that goes with, trying to establish time frames, date lines, and what have you, or not to mention, where does that source of information derive from? We're living in a time now where all of our information is literally at our fingertips. It's up to us to basically be able to put in that information to find that information to which we are seeking to understand, and moreover going over it and over it and not being married to it, to understanding and having a much more broader perspective of things and a better understanding, quite frankly. And many people who are very fundamentalist and very militant almost, and especially whenever it comes to like religiosity, you have to understand that it's their comfort zone in a lot of ways. It becomes their identity, because it's like if you're trying to question that, you're questioning their identity. You're questioning every aspect of who they think they are, based upon that. And I am saying kind of like walk that line of compassion at the same time, wanting to have your own ideas of boundaries and respect and everything else. And so I think what it is one of the reasons that we're seeing so many people walk away from organized religion in droves is that maybe because of the great spiritual awakening that is in fact occurring on the planet, is that people, like I said, they're waking up to how that manipulation affects somebody that might very well be of a certain mindset, and how that transcends into, well, wait a minute, we've been brainwashed. And many times over, a lot of us are programmed in certain ways. We don't always necessarily see it, and it's up to us to really truly look inward to see these programs and kind of break those ties, if you would, cut those ribbons, cut those strings. How do we begin to do that? Well, obviously, looking inward is probably a tremendous start. And then, kind of noticing behavioral patterns and things of that nature. And one of the things that's always perplexed me, as well as at times terrified me, was the notion of people not questioning their own validity, their own, architecture of their brain, so to speak, of why do I think this? Where does this come from? Is this truly who I am? Is this truly me? Or is this just simply the programming of the matrix? Those are the things that, a lot of people from a very rigid mindset, you will not many times over catch them actually necessarily doing that. And as I said before, the prefrontal cortex is one that kind of like edits things and tells you not to say what or at this particular time or whatever. And a lot of them don't seem to have that aspect of editing. They just come out with whatever, no matter how crass nor how hurtful it very well might be. But as society progresses, we're learning more and more, that number one, walking away from religious fundamentalism is most likely very much a positive thing, and realizing our own divinity from within, and now how that translates into basically religion taking a back seat to what actually truly needs to happen within on this planet, as far as finding that source and that connection from within. It's going to take a nice backseat, just because of the fact that, now spirituality and divinity within ourselves is taking the steering wheel and taking it in a completely different direction from it. And like I said, we're seeing a lot of the chaos, a lot of the trash, if you would, being thrust into our face, whether it's with what happened with those, that church on Pawleys Island with, the ministers and everything else that got arrested recently within the past week, I might add, and how that translates. Like, well, that trash needs to be seen. It needs to be understood that this is not the way, we should handle, things, or, do things or whatever. We should always be protective, not of just ourselves, but of people that don't have any defenses. And that goes into the idea of understanding the boundaries from within. Just food for thought. I want you guys really take a look at everything and take a listen to my newest podcast, my episode of Revealing the Truth of Bram Wells, where I talk about neuroscience and how it actually does affect the prefrontal cortex of the brain, and how it works with organized religion, fundamentalism, etc. Please take a listen. This is the only way we can actually really truly achieve understanding all of the stuff that we've been seeing as of in the past several months, several weeks, several years, however you want to say it. Thank you so much.